Hey there! Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And it's a big one. We've got the newest project from 21 Pilots, Clancy. There's a part of me that felt deeply vindicated in the rollout for this album, and probably not for reasons folks will like. See, I have long accepted that I'm a half step outside of the 21 Pilots fandom, mostly because for as much as this band can create lore that the Clique will endlessly pick apart and then expound upon, I've always operated on it being largely metaphorical and self-referential. The details are less important than the broad emotional scope. Because for as much as the iconography tries to create this veneer of mystery and dark complexity, see Trench and all the my messy frustrations I had with that project, I also hear a lot of nerdy, way too self-aware wish fulfillment, from the fast rapping to the overwrought bombast to every reference to their own music. It's why I still think Blurryface is their best album. It's also one of the big reasons I still really love Scaled and Icy to this day. It's a pop swerve that was way more bright and chipper and discarding so much of that angst, but also leveraged rock-solid pop fundamentals and some really savvy meta text in order to integrate that story. And wouldn't you know, in the lore catch-up video the band released prior to this album, that metatextual interpretation was largely validated. It places Scaled and Icy in continuity alongside Trench and Blurryface, and as someone who doesn't really care for the lore but appreciates the thematic arc, that really works for me. Now, it did receive, let's call it, mixed reaction from fans, and yes, they still had fans after Scaled and Icy, albeit fewer because Fueled by Ramen can't effectively push a pop single to save their lives, and they had at least 3 on that album that should have charted really highly on the Hot 100, but honestly, it didn't concern me as much as shifts in personnel. Now, given that Scaled and Icy was recorded during the pandemic, they only got spare production assistance from Greg Kirsten, primary Blurryface collaborator Mike Elizondo, and Trench producer Paul Meany, the last of whom was specifically working on the tracks calling back to Trench on the end of the album, and he's also the primary producer here. And given one of my issues with Trench was how dour and monochromatic it could be, that could lead to mixed results, but I did really like Overcompensate as a lead-off single. I had high hopes for this, so what did we get? Well, folks, this is a weird one, because I've been giving this a lot of attention, and for as much as folks are citing this as that big return to form since Scaled and Icy, I can't remotely agree, because Clancy feels like an album to give people what they want, but once you start digging into the details, you might regret that. Superficially, on a textural basis and tone, it feels reminiscent of Trench, but with none of the immensity and grandiosity, and the lore's effectively been thrown aside, as it seems like the songwriting is more deeply rooted in pop compositions and structures and smaller scale lyricism that kind of reminds me more of Vessel than Blurryface, made all the more frustrating because the emotional growth from Scaled and Icy is also here, so it wants to be taken very seriously, but the bigger question becomes, in what context? So it leads to an album where I get why some folks are finding resonance with it, but has left me a decent bit colder than I was hoping. I mean, it's still good, I just struggle to say it's among their best, albeit for different reasons than some parts of the rabid fanbase. So here's my exceedingly rare olive branch, and I can't believe I'm doing this, to the Clique. I mean, listen, we haven't gotten along for over 10 years now, but I get the raw disappointment and frustration. If you cared about the lore and the universe building on Trench, you heard Overcompensate, and then you listened to this album to effectively hear it consigned to bookending the project, with the secret outro on Paladin Strait, where you hear Clancy meet Blurryface for that final ambiguous confrontation. Now, to me, it all makes sense, as it effectively shows how all the lore was largely symbolic and metaphorical of Tyler Joseph's internal struggles, but you know, if you were invested in that story or iconography and have then heard it thrown aside, when you're in the genius annotations trying to desperately connect all the dots and reference all the music videos to try to make it all make sense, yeah, I'm sorry, that's tough. Especially when the band did so much cryptic shit over the course of multiple albums to try and get you to care. Now, is the lesson here to focus more on the underlying emotionality and symbolic themes over the lore and Easter eggs? Yeah, probably, but I'm not gonna blame the Clique for struggling there because A, the effort has been sincere in engaging with the text for its own sake, B, music and a lot of associated art around it tend to be more abstract than traditional narrative, and C, let's keep it a buck. This is a lesson that nerd culture, movie Twitter, comics Twitter, and the vast majority of the viewing and listening public needs to learn themselves a hell of a lot faster. So now that all that's out of the way, why isn't this fully clicking for me? Well, let's start off with the content, because following off of Scaled and Icy, I was already primed to like the writing here. Tyler Joseph's gotten older, the timbre of his insecurity has changed, and while there are overlapping elements with previous projects, struggles with depression, substance abuse, imposter syndrome, increasing annoyance and contempt for the music industry, and then the culpability of playing into it, and when you're in your mid-30s and have a stable relationship and kids, your perspective will shift. And let's be clear, that context was established on Scaled and Icy if you were paying attention. That album was deliberately focused on family connections, ducking out of the spotlight, where the climactic dark synths and choral vocals on No Chances and the exhausted ache of Redecorate signaled that because of the industry he chose, he's going to be back on the road, for better and for worse. And as early as Backslide, you can tell that Tyler Joseph was stung pretty hard by a lot of fans largely rejecting Scaled and Icy. And not gonna lie, I was really annoyed by him second-guessing Saturday. That's one of the band's best pop songs, one of my favorite songs of 2021, because the fandom never bothered to grasp the larger thematic context where that song makes sense, especially on an emotional level, going back to the darkness and insecurities of Trench. That's also a Backslide, even if he's now trying to reclaim it. And it also brings out some of those old demons that he thought he could have left behind. Now look, in theory, I'm not against going back to old territory, especially when it comes to this sort of insecurity and angst. One of the best things Jason Isbell ever illuminated on the Nashville Sound back in 2017 is that you can't just slam the door on addiction or depression or those underlying insecurities. They often linger just out of sight, ready to resurface when times get dark. But I also really appreciate Midwest Indigo coming right after Backslide, where the little things are starting to cause him to spiral, but with greater resources at his disposal, there's a better shot of getting through it. The instability and angst is still there, but it feels better managed. He is now firmly knows that self-destruction is not the only way to paradise, which has me wishing there was a little bit more depth that felt new in these pictures. They're very familiar. The dissociations of routines in the night and navigating feel like cycles we have seen, as does the relationship angst of the ukulele-driven The Craving, which just felt a little flat to me. It's no formidable. Then there's Lavish, taking the piss out of the cheap decadence of the music industry, and while everyone was rolling in their eyes at the borderline nonsensical plastic extravagance of that second verse, to me it just honestly came across as really lazy and kind of regressive. Tyler Joseph has proven not to be above a bad anal sex reference tied to the music industry, but it's also playing into cheap stereotypes that reminds me of the conservative streak this band can have. But this is also what happens when on the next couple songs, Tyler Joseph admits that for as much as he doesn't want to go backwards, he feels like he's reached the end of this road. He commandeered a hot ride, he drove until the engine died, all the progress is gone, and with the future coming up fast, he's got nothing in the tank. It's one reason I really like Oldies Station, mostly because he's now grappling with getting older and having to push through into unfamiliar territory, and necessarily returning to more personal framing. He's a parent, he's lost family and friends, and given that Tyler Joseph has reportedly said that song is directed at the audience, it's probably the most direct critique of nostalgia for him and them alike. Of course, when you sell the album off of playing that nostalgia to set up the bait and switch, you're gonna piss people off. Eminem has done this multiple times and looks to be setting it up yet again on his album this summer, and that's another fan base that never seems to get the clue and message. But if this is what is required to finally confront everything else head on, rebuild oneself to face Blurryface or Nico, because really thematically they are one and the same, I get why you do it this way. I also appreciate that on the closing track he admits he's might be past the point of no return. You don't get that many more chances to recycle all of this iconography, especially given how pointed this critique of nostalgia is. Although also in that lore video, he admits that it might not be the last time he goes here. Go figure. But okay, if I managed to do so much to peel into the details of the writing that I like, is there a deeper problem? Well, this is where we get into the execution and production, and where I'm probably going to butt heads with the same folks that were expecting the same sound palette as Trench, and, well, they mostly got it. It is darker, it's heavier, it's more ponderous. It doesn't run as long as Trench, but can feel long, thanks to the choices of instrumental textures that lean more towards that dour grayscale and the vibrant melodies of Blurry Face or Scaled and Icy. I mean, for me, it's just not grabbing my ear as strongly, which is where I circle back to the discrepancy between the tighter pop structures and the production choices that don't always pay them off. And I caught onto this early. After Overcompensate sets up that darker vibe and is a great lead-off single, we get Next Semester, which is clearly trying for this jaunty 2010s post-punk throwback with the bass line and the rattling, galloping lead melody and the woos. But the electric ukulele rattle blends into this slurry accented by pianos, with the momentum kind of short-circuited by the slower ending, and none of that verve actually punching through. And that might fit for the chilly blips of Backslide that's generally catchy melodically, but it also feels like it's hovering in this odd, colorless middle ground, dragging back Joseph's overdub squawking. I mean, Snapback falls in this territory too. Thank God Midwest Indigo has a really strong, bouncy, melodic groove to make up for that hideous, gooey synth that opens up the track unsupported, and thankfully is better blended by some of the later hooks. But something seems off with a lot of the synth choices all over this album, come to think of it, where they either feel formless and weirdly canned, or they blare in a fashion that draws attention to every single awkward tone, like across the opening of Navigating or the bridge of Oldies Station. They managed to ramp up the grooves enough to compensate. I'm on board. And then we get the attempts at elegance with the wheezy strings passages on Vignette and Lavish that feel really lacking in the body and tone. And you know, I have danced around this for about 10 years now, and it feels all the more obvious with pop frameworks against the Trench-like textures. The compression on the vocal leads is really starting to get distracting. The problem is not that it's there. I've given 21 Pilots a pass on this before, especially for their pop stuff where it makes sense. But alongside a palette that might demand a little more organic texture and depth, it comes across as really over-processed and unneeded. I mean, it's balanced out better with the gentle, hazy acoustics on Oldies Station that tilt towards psychedelia, similar to how Paladin Strait bends its acoustic line to a very 60s progressive melody. And it reminds me of the Elton John elements in the pianos that drifted on Mulberry Street on the last album. Tastes of more eclectic influences that would be cool to hear from this band if they weren't fighting production that seems designed to leech any color from the palette. So many of these songs should hit harder than they do, but the production is just not doing them any favors, and it's not heavy enough to back this up. But then again, it's not surprising. This was my biggest complaint with Trench. I know I'm in the minority with it, and while I found a decent number of great songs here, Clancy does feel intensely compromised. A course correction back towards what got them the critical acclaim, but also admonishing the audience for expecting it by intentionally playing to some similar themes and then deconstructing it. The only reason it doesn't feel more bitter is because Tyler Joseph, to his credit, has grown up enough to value more important things. And I think he's hoping that everyone else does as well. If only the tonal execution of this project didn't feel at odds with itself, I'd probably like this a lot more. And it honestly makes it kind of hard to recommend even as a good album. A lot of the albums so reliant on metatext past and present tend to be a tough sell. And if you're just here for strong hooks or the potent bangers, I don't know, 21 Pilots has done this better on previous projects, and I think they know it. Returning to this well is gonna have diminishing returns, and they say it on the actual record. As a whole, I do think it's mostly good. If you're curious, it's worth a listen. But if this is the end of this particular framing and arc of the story, we might be better for it. All I'm saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, and subscribe. Look folks, I really wanted to love this album as much as I have loved their other projects. I know I'm out of step with the fandom, and I know that I'm going to get backlash for this for being cooler on this than I was for Scaled and Icy, which I think is a better album. I think Blurry Face is a better album too. Honestly, on some level, I think Trench is better on some level. But hey, like again, a lot of this is opinion. I think I get where I'm against the odds and against a lot of the audience on this. I'm comfortable being the minority. Just be civil in the comments here. We're all trying to find something to like with this band. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved and help and support the channel, get albums on my schedule coming up in July, maybe just yell at me on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand. The option's available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.